It's always good to see you guys, especially when you have some Muppets in the background. Some of my favorite characters. Oh, oh my God, is that Fozzie?
The Eagle?
Oh, he's great. The American
Sam
Eagle. I don't see him. Sam the Eagle is not there. Okay,
I wonder how you feel about the fuel crisis right now. It's hitting planes too.
Well, it's hitting the planes like, being out on the West Coast, we're kind of used to this stuff, right? Fluctuations and paying more and kind of just throwing up our hands and saying, it's more taxes, more fuel costs, more this, more that. And there's a whole lot of reasons behind it, but I kind of feel kind of Muppetish at times about what the hell's going on these days. When there are puppets, you know what that demands, right? There has to be a puppeteer. And these days, I think that you don't direct that in any one entity, but you can direct it on the overall regulation and the industry pressure that is brought upon all the participants these days in a lot of different ways. And there's some good reasons for some of that stuff, and then there's some reasons that lack depth and logic. I think one of the things that we're trying to do, having these chats, these conversations about various subjects, is to try to determine through dialogue, what's really going on out there and what is logical, what the next steps are, whose agenda is what, and what are the end goals of some of these people.
We were driving around today, and my wife asked me a pretty interesting question, and I'm going to pose it to you guys. Are our gas prices, granted, Ukraine stuff, whatever, supply chain, blah, blah, blah. But do you think they're raising the gas prices so they can force us into electric vehicles? Is there a play in that? Is there a ulterior motive for that? She hasn't heard it from anywhere, but she obviously senses something that's pushing that pricing. It's one thing to say, yeah, we're having a pipeline conflict over there, but we still have fuel here. How does gas price go from $4, $3 respectively, wherever you are in the country, to nearly double that in such a short amount of time where, the supply takes, 2 or 3 weeks before it gets here. So how is it even short, like a week after?
Well, oil's a commodity, right? And it's funny because growing up back in a small farming town in Michigan, you'd go to the school in the morning and the radio would be on, and you'd hear them talking about the futures of certain commodities, pork bellies, things like that, farming oriented futures. And what that is it's a bet as to what the value of those items will become over short and long periods of time. And that sets the current rate that people pay, because if the value is being analyzed that it will become a certain amount over a certain period of time, then people are willing to pay more or less depending on what that valuation is. And oil's the same way. Oil is sold on the international market, not locally. Everybody talks about producing oil here, LNG and things like that, and all that's very important. But it's not like you can turn on the spigot. It's like,
I think it's Jen Psaki.
She talks about, hey, you can't just turn this on and suddenly there's supply. Well, she's right about that from two standpoints. But she's also wrong about it, because when you turn on the ability to create supply, you're increasing the future value or decreasing the future value of that commodity by putting more supply into its potential future, thus lowering the price overall internationally. That's kind of the game that's being played. But I think that your wife brings up a very good point, because when you look at all that's happening here, it's hard not to assume agendas are at play. And with all the large amounts of money in the infrastructure bill, through all kinds of technological advances that have come on, there's been a push for many, many years, especially from the West Coast driving east, or actually it starts on the West Coast and it kind of follows the coasts and pushes inland. These ideas of changing to a very green economy. And I'm all for production of alternate resources to provide us a better future for, the generations to come. I'm all for that. But I'm also a course correction type of person. I think things should be done in a gradualist nature. And nowadays it's more of a disruption. It's more of let's peel everything down to its bare bones and build it back up again. but let's do it in 2 seconds instead of 20 years.
You've probably seen the clip from Stephen Colbert talking about how it's not a big deal to him because he drives a Tesla and all sorts of little, he's supposed to be a comedian, so I understand that it was supposed to be a job funny thing. But the reality is most people don't drive electric cars, and a lot of people can't afford them. A lot of people can't even afford replacing their current gas-powered vehicle with a gas-powered vehicle. It's difficult out there right now. And speaking from experience, as someone who's been waitlisted for an electric car for a while and probably going to be waiting a lot longer, it's not exactly easy with the chip shortages going on. There's lots of reasons why
A lot of
electric
dynamics.
vehicles still are a very difficult thing to get, and they're very expensive.
You know what we should do? We should continue this dialogue in as many different directions as we can, because that's part of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand directionally where we're going as an industry, where we're going as a civilization, really. But it'd be nice to add in somebody that's become more of an expert in the EV industry. So I'm going to try to get somebody online here in just a second. But let's go ahead and continue the conversation while I shoot an email out to him.
For the average consumer, is it affordable? I don't know. For the average family of 4 or 5 trying to buy an electric vehicle to cart all their kids around to different schools, elementary school, middle school, high school, is it necessarily an easy transition for them? No.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's get somebody that's got a different perspective on this, because he is inside that industry and in a position to help try to create an infrastructure that will allow some of the things for people like you, Jen, to get off that wait list and into the vehicle you're looking for. So that's a good thing. But welcome, Adan Zamora. We were talking just for a little while, and I'm really happy that you were able to join us, because there's kind of an undertow perspective of people that aren't even in our industry, in the transportation logistics supply chain industry, that are looking at a lot of what's going on these days, not just the prices wildly being volatile at the gas pump, but the regulations, some of the agendas being pushed, et cetera. And they feel like a lot of things are lining up intentionally to purposely move us toward an electric future. And I would love to hear your perspective, not just on the commercial vehicles that are coming out, but kind of what you see, especially now that you've been in that business type for a while, what you see coming in your perspective on how the common man, if you will, or even the common industry person can be a part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a whole bunch of different points there that you just hit on, Chris. But just from a very high level perspective, I want to say that here in California, there's a great deal of time that's being spent to support this effort. From a state standpoint, you have the public utilities organizations, some of them private, some of them state, mandated by the overseers of those utility companies, and you have just everybody underneath that's kind of in a race to market, so to speak, to deploy these new technologies and to take advantage of the different subsidies that are available at both the federal and state level. So what we're seeing is you have a bunch of different stakeholders right now looking at what's possible with current infrastructure, what that supports, and how quickly we can beef that up so that we can support higher levels of charge dispensing, so that we can build the facilities that are needed, really, so that this can keep up with how much consumer demand is currently taking place in the marketplace with plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, fully electric vehicles, and I'm talking at just the consumer level right now. But we're going to see, more and more programs that are starting to gain traction. A lot of these public charging stations that are available now are at different hotels. That's where a lot of the focus has been. We're going to start to see more enforcement from the air quality management districts. You have them all over the state. They have, of course, the warehouse indirect rules that are going to be more strictly enforced. So we have organizations that are going to be very focused on certain segments of deployment. You know, you have your level 2 chargers, fast charging that's available for Tesla superchargers, and you have your standard home chargers, like in-home overnight chargers that charge at a rate of about 8 hours for a full charge, or beyond 12 hours. More specifically on the heavy duty sector, we're looking at deployment of heavy duty rated chargers by the end of the year in different locations across the state. Our competitors, you know, are very well established in the space. You know, they've got national grids. What they're doing is more focused on charge systems that are able to support 2 vehicles at once, and it's mostly consumer. You know, everybody knows who Tesla is. You know, what Tesla is developing, their MCS technology is really going to change the game in the industry, because, you know, we're talking about a technology that will be able to charge a big rig that has a range of 500 miles in 20 to 30 minutes. That's really going to be
so. Let me, if I can, just slow you down just for a second or two, because even for people within the industry, some of the stuff that you're talking about is, you know, it hits me right between the eyes and then goes flying over my head. You know, some of the technology changes are happening so fast, but it seems to me that there are kind of 2 points that are happening at kind of the same time. There's this infrastructural component that needs to be accommodated, because other than that, you have, you know, it's kind of like PCs, right? I remember, I hate to say it, but I remember when computers first came out, you know, there was this on campus, in a distance was your support. In other words, you had to tie into some mechanism across campus that supported your ability to get on a dummy terminal and do something. And then it evolved to having a personal PC, which is just sitting on your desktop with the capacity to do something itself. It's kind of like having a charging station at a distance in only one place. Then your self-charging station, like, I don't know, you know, something on the tractor trailer or personal vehicle, or something in your home, et cetera. And then computerization went out to the cloud, right? So that now the larger ability for computerization and programmability and things like that is way more advanced, not because you're not just sitting on your laptop, but you're dealing with this giant infrastructure. I think these type of technologies kind of lead the same way. And, you know, it's in its infancy in a way for the business side. But you mentioned a second ago kind of 2 things that really jumped out at me. And number one, I want to make sure that we say that your company is one of the companies that's really, you know, kind of leading the way and trying to drive toward kind of a combination between infrastructure and the components to support the infrastructure, and that's Watt EV. So anybody that wants to look that up, you can do a little commercial for that in a few minutes. But number one, subsidy, right? That's something that really drives the nature of change when it's supported by government agencies, so whether local, state, or federal. And I think that the only way this comes to the common small business owner, or the person like Jen who is on a wait list for an electric vehicle, is when there's some kind of subsidy. That otherwise, only Stephen Colbert and his like will be buying stuff, right? That's kind of a crazy way to go, because I think the stat is from a non-commercial side, it's maybe 3% of the vehicles in the United States are electric, 3%. And yet the whole country wants to drive toward this. And the other thing you mentioned is in the indirect rules that are becoming enforced. So what's happened is that's just a kind of a soft form of regulation. It's a regulation put on large companies, but it's going to spill down to the smaller companies supporting those large companies. And if anybody out there wants to know more about that, you can look at, I think it's episode 3 or 4, Jaws, Bytes, et cetera. I go into that whole indirect source rule and a lot of things around that. It's a very interesting concept, but it forces change. The way I see it is that from a non-commercial standpoint, they've done some years of work from Prius on up till now to develop things that are attractive and are bringing more people into that space. But from the commercial side, it feels like there's more pressure to make it happen. It's not, you mentioned consumer demand. It's not, the non-commercial seems like the consumers are starting to demand it. The commercial it seems like they're demanding it because it's being forced upon them.
Well, I would agree. I think we talked about it on our last little get together about the Super Bowl commercials, and there was a huge amount of Super Bowl commercials for electric vehicles from a consumer standpoint, from the general public, replacing your old Ford with a new Ford, but it's all electric. And I think most experts would say, especially in California, you just got to plan ahead because it's coming one way or another. The question is how quickly. Smaller companies are going to have to decide what they're willing to spend the bulk of their money on. Electrification is a major factor, especially when it comes to consumers looking at where their goods are coming from. We talked about this last time too. It's huge in the food industry and the fashion industry. People look at where their things are made. Now they're going to start looking at how they get to their house, exactly from the point of creation to the point they get it in their hands. And if someone is really gung-ho about making sure that it is done in whatever way they believe, they're going to make a stink about the fact that, oh, it was made ethically, but it wasn't delivered, quote unquote, ethically.
You're right. It is at its infancy. If the guys who are running electric trucks today, most of it is behind the fence charge applications. And so the company I'm with now is really focused on building the infrastructure from a public charge station for heavy duty commercial use, medium and heavy duty. And how we're doing that is through our mission objective, which is essentially to reduce the barrier of entry into electric for transporters. And more specifically, smaller transporters. We want to take the 10 and 20 truck fleets, the owner operators, the guys that own 1, 2, 3 trucks, even one truck. And we want to offer them a program that really is a no out of pocket scenario for them so that they can look at this and compare it to an existing diesel program and say, wow, I can really make this work. I can adopt this new technology. And we're doing it in a way where the program itself, the cost behind it, it has the charge built into it. So it's an all-inclusive deal. That's probably the best way to market for us is the way we see capturing this audience. We want to make sure that it doesn't really have any dog hair on it. We've already held some very preliminary conversations with some transporters and some owner operators, and the interest is certainly there. I think their biggest concern is obviously, how am I going to keep this thing wheels rolling and making money? And so our flagship location in Bakersfield is slated to be operational Q4 this year. We've got some other sites under development in California, and we have some models that we'd be very interested in sharing with anybody who's interested in learning more about these programs.
Are there even commercial tractors that are available now for drivers, and how much do those bad boys run?
Yeah, absolutely, Nico. There are tractors available now. Volvo North America is probably the leading OEM in this particular space. They seem to be a little more focused in the electric space, and their range shows it in comparison to some of the other OEs that are out there. A lot of these other OEs are currently running pilots, of course, but to speak on the product that I'm most familiar with, the Volvo product, phase 1 units have a range of about 150 miles, and those are in market today and running successfully, back and forth within California, harbor locations back to yard locations. And there's actually a report out there that I want to plug here for you guys to look at. It's got some really, really useful information called Roll on Electric. And it actually provides some driver insights on their use of this initial technology with Volvo. Now, the trucks that we're going to be deploying in the market later this year are their phase 2 product, which has got a range that's marketed as 250 miles. So we're really excited about that particular level up in the space.
Yeah, and of course, the next step is really the mileage is the main concern at this point for anybody putting themselves out there for an electric vehicle, simply because of they've got to look at their own network and say, okay, what is our traditional round trip miles? And can we accommodate a charging station in one location first as this thing develops? Because I'm sure your plan is to have them in a lot of different places eventually, because the main differential point in a regular diesel truck, aside from the overall initial costing element, which it sounds like you've tried to pull out of that the way you've included certain things. The initial thing is you can go to every corner and get some diesel, but you can't with the electric at this point. And when you say behind the fence technology, I think you're talking about mobile charging or on-site charging with some kind of battery operate. And of course that limits, I mean, I would assume the electrical grid and the cities involved have to have the appropriate, ability to provide that type of electricity for either quick charging or even overnight charging stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, behind the fence charging is grid connected charging that's typically more of a privately owned scenario where X entity or X carrier is purchasing the charge dispensing technology, they're connecting it to the grid, and they're able to charge behind the fence in a non-public form where not every carrier can go there and just use their charging location. That's really where Watt EV differentiates from, what's available in the heavy duty space right now. Most carriers are having to go to a mobile charge trailer type setup where you have a generator that's connected to the grid. It's dispensing technology, charging to the trucks, or even non-grid connected applications. I won't expand on that, but you guys can kind of.
Well, you can imagine. Yeah, we
that.
can. It's interesting. Nico brought up in a previous conversation a week or two ago the idea, and this was, I think, interconnected with our talk about the indirect source rule, which, just for everybody out there as a reminder, basically anybody that has 100,000 square feet or more, I think it was Orange County. I always want to say Air Resource Board, but there's a different acronym for them.
Southern California Air Quality Management District.
Okay, thank you. You should know all these kind of things by heart, more than me. That's for sure. But basically, they've for a long time had what's called a Wares point system that analyzes particulates in the air going into and out of facilities to try to gauge how the pollutants affect those particular communities. And in the case of 100,000 square foot or more, this rule is now no longer, it's being an actual rule in functionality, and it's going to start to be enforced. And that's true for people that own the warehouses or people that are actually leasing into those warehouses. So now this has been expanded to people coming in and out of those facilities in trucks. So the idea is to get people to zero or near zero emissions situations, which is right in your sweet spot. But the thing that Nico mentioned that I thought was so important was, we used, I think, Walmart as an example, maybe it was Amazon, I don't remember, but these large companies have the ability to have engagements with a company like yours and put the same facility or stations in place, I would imagine, so that that would encourage the environment, the community, the transportation community to further invest in electric technology, because they know when they deliver those facilities, whether with their own fleet or outside fleets, they'll be able to, okay, you're going to be at the dock for an hour and a half, get a charge, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And maybe at some point even charge for that charge, right? Or take it off the transportation bill or however. Hopefully I'm not giving too many people ideas, because I would rather not have Walmart charge me for charging my electric vehicle. But
Walmart will come up with that idea on their own, don't worry.
They'll give you free Walmart cards for
That's exactly right, Chris. You hit on a lot of points there that are valid in current day market. If you start to talk to some of the charge dispensing companies that are out in market right now, they offer all those types of scenarios, and some of it is revenue share deals with the warehouse owner or with the landlord in that particular space. I know that there's currently programs at the state level that offer basically fully reimbursable programs. So I think the way it works is you pay initially for it, but it's fully reimbursable once it's operational and you're offering the charge to a public environment.
So the thing I look at with all this is there's so much money being pushed into this space. And while I'm not opposed to the space at all, I think you all know me well enough to know that when you go in a direction like this, that's good for a very long-term societal changes, I think it's smart to move toward it. But I feel like it's crushing the smaller companies. And I think that's probably one of the hardest parts for a company like yours, Aiden, to look at, because I mean, I think it's easy to go to the big guys and say, let's make some big deals and really get this thing going. But what ends up happening in a lot of these things when there's regulations and the drive to do something is it wipes out the smaller guys. You mentioned specifically owner operators and things like that, but how would you get is it a pure subsidy play or is there something more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, that's completely the focus. You know, we are looking at this from a whole perspective where we're not looking to align with one group or the other. Our main objective is to electrify heavy duty fleets. So the way we treat a large customer from the way we treat a small customer, there's really no differentiation in that. And you know, another way as I look at this and say, well, you know, how do we penetrate the smaller markets? How do we make sure we're reaching those owner operators? Is we're really going to have to develop an ecosystem that can have that reach with those smaller owner operators, you know, via bilingual staff, you know, people who can translate, people who can make sure that they're actually getting the other side of the table to understand what our programs mean to them and what the transition is really from diesel to electric. So from an outreach perspective, we're definitely creating the ecosystem and the programs that are going to be looked at from face value with, you know, a real transition plan to electric. You know, the ports have their mandates, the state has their mandates. I don't think there's any question as to whether this is a future or not. I mean, it's coming. It's time for people to look at this in the face and say, I need to formulate a plan of adoption here. Otherwise, I won't be a trucker in the future. And so, you know, my message to carriers of all sizes is take a look at us. Let's engage. Let's start to have those conversations.
With regards to, you know, because sometimes I feel like it's a carrot or the stick when it comes to these subsidies that the government offers, because ultimately, yeah, we're, you know, specifically in California, my concern, just being a citizen of California, if you think about it, well, we haven't found a viable alternative to power, right? We're still generating electricity from, you know, we're not allowed to build any more nuclear power, so nuclear power is out there, not available. We would literally have to cover the entire state of California to make solar power a viable option, so that, you know, unless they found a way to, and I know there's smarter people out there that are thinking about making solar panel roofs and solar powered whatever to make that happen, but that the technology is in development, but it's still a ways out still. Wind power generates its own unrecyclable waste, so there's always going to be this to and from. So my ultimate concern is, okay, so I'm not paying as much at the pump, but now because I'm pulling more electricity from the grid, my electricity bill is now $800 to $1,000, whereas with regular fossil fuel at the current moment, you know, I'm still at a good balance where I can afford to drive to and from. And I think that's probably something that even small mom and pop carriers are going to have to really contend with, because ultimately, yeah, it'd be nice to be on the cutting edge of technology, but at the same time, there's this level that you have to generate enough profit so that the company stays running, but at the same time, you also want to have enough for innovation and whatnot. And I think the challenging part ultimately is, you know, having worked in the trucking industry and being an IT guy myself, I mean, we have tractors out there that are 1974 with like 800,000 miles, and not because they don't want the newer truck. It's because replacing an engine is still cheaper than having to buy a net new.
No, anytime you have new innovative technologies, their first adopters are always it's like anything else, manufacturing anything. Somebody has to buy it and adopt those programs before it becomes ubiquitous enough to drive the costs down. And I see that as the intentional reason that governments are supplying so much subsidy into this space, is to try to get it to a point to drive the cost down. Well, there's two ways of doing that, of course, back to what your wife was saying originally, Nico, is that one way is to drive the cost down. The other way is to drive the opponent technology cost up, right? And that's oil. So there's a lot of disruption in that arena. the question really becomes is, do we have the resources for this technology as well? The rare earth mineral resources, things like that are required, the chips themselves. The next invasion might be simply over the fact that the place that most chips are made happens to be a target for one of the world powers out there. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in this. And whether this technology or something similar will be the next big thing is debatable. But this is the direction that the powers that be have decided to focus their attention on. I'm saying this the wrong way, but you shouldn't push back on it. You should accept that it's happening. It's just that you've got to develop the right programs to make it happen.
And my challenge to that is, like when the iPhones came out, right? When the iPhones first came out, it was very market driven as far as adoption of that technology. So when you're having regulators, lawmakers, and if someone tried to develop a better iPhone and failed, they went out of business, right? But when a government decides, and I'm not opposed to EV. I actually like technology. I'm a geek when it comes to tech. I love everything, latest and greatest. But ultimately, if you have a government, with a stick telling you have to go EV, whether you can afford it or not, whether your family can afford it or not, whether the state can support it or not, whether we have trucking stations that can support EV or not, we're gonna do this. There comes a point where you go, well, how do we make that work with the infra? We're not generating our own electricity anymore, or they're not letting us develop those kinds of things. The challenge is, when the market drives it, when the demand, like, there's a steady rate of growth towards innovating the next new iPhone, right? But when you're forced to do it, there comes a point where the hammer might be too heavy, and people are going, I'm just going to move out of the state.
Well, you don't run out of taxpayers to pay for subsidies. You just go to a different level of government to figure out how to make that happen. And I think that embracing technologies is appropriate. I think that when you have the main technology that runs our world in terms of energy is coal and oil, and those in the predominance of the world population is going to continue to run those for a long time. So at some point you have to ask yourself, how are we going to change technology and move forward and advance? Solar, wind, whatever the case may be, hydrogen, doesn't matter. There's a lot of different things you can talk about. And somebody has to take the lead on that. And I don't think there's a problem with the United States, California in particular, being the tip of the spear on something like this and moving it forward. The question I always have is how do you make that happen? And Nico, to your point, you feel forced. Well, that's what regulations are. They draw some lines around things, maybe for safety reasons, maybe for pollution reasons, maybe for the betterment of the next generation, all those kinds of things we can talk about. But I don't think the debate really is around whether we should or should not. I think the debate is how, and at what speed, and at what impact. The large companies can absorb this kind of thing. They can look at their margins. They can see that they can gain some share in the market by doing certain things a certain way and adopt technologies much quicker. My interest in this discussion really is, how do we overcome the challenges of allowing the smaller companies to not only participate, but to thrive in that environment? And maybe what Adan is talking about, having a company that's building the infrastructure actually helps subsidize that facet of our industry. Maybe that is the answer. I don't know. Time will tell. But we're moving in that direction no matter what.
And look, I get it. Like, regulation allowed us to have safer cars, when, airbags and seatbelts, right? Regulations allowed us to go from the 70s where we had, V8s that went like 1 mile per gallon, or 10 gallons per mile when you step on it, So I get the whole regulation does help drive that choice, and all for it. I guess at this point we're kind of hedging our bets on a few things that that I think maybe one day someone will come up with this bad boy. Look at that.
Oh, there you go. That is
So,
perfect. There's
yeah,
the
so
real answer right there.
so if you think about it, because I mean, obviously, what what all this talk about innovations of what's coming, because eventually one of these days EV will be 70-80%, part of our life. It'll be everywhere. Our houses will be electric. It'll be green as we possibly can, be it market driven or regulatory driven. What's going to upset EV? Something bigger, better, faster. Pulling
Flux capacitor.
hydrogen driven motors. It's going to be a fascinating next 2 or 3 decades, because the drive to go EV is, there's someone out there looking. It's like, how can we displace that?
Yeah.
Sure.
What are your thoughts? I know we're going in a million different directions on this, but what are your thoughts overall?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of address some of Nico's concerns. I could tell you're very concerned, Nico. Not really. I know you do well, but no, there's going to be opportunities for microgrids across the state, especially in places where land is available. And the idea on the commercial side, I think there's a lot of naysayers out there that are saying, well, you're not going to be able to charge this many trucks because it's too much, voltage being taken up, and there's too high of a demand amongst consumers. Well, there's too many smart guys in the room, for starters, to say something like that, to not be able to design a system on where we could charge these vehicles during a time where there isn't that much load demand on the system. So I wanted to plug that in there. Off-peak charging, basically, or off-peak shaving is what they call it in the electric sector, I believe. So our public charge rates are going to be in line with public utility charge rates. What they look like now and what they'll look like in 2 years from now, that's an unknown. But what we're currently planning for takes some of the future into consideration, and it's supposed to be at a very affordable rate. More affordable than what some of the current public charge stations offer. Some of it is through subsidy, some not. But our entire ecosystem is designed in a way that it's self-supporting of itself as we expand in our site locations and as we scale up. Most of the dispensers will be CCS in the beginning, but our entire electrical design is based on being able to upgrade to MCS when that technology is deployed. From a regulatory standpoint, I have to agree with you. I mean, nobody likes being told you have to do this. I think that's just human nature. But I want to focus on the positives of this. It's decarbonizing supply chains, making sure that our environment is protected over long term, and creating even a new way of trucking, because some of the feedback, as you guys will look at that, what I plugged earlier, is that these drivers, they have more energy at the end of their shifts. And there's been enough discussion, Chris, in the past that talks about, well, how could we expect to add more time into a driver's schedule to kind of speed up the supply chain and create more efficiencies? This is definitely a way to do that. Will it increase the averages of safety over a 5-year period? I think so. I think we'll see that. I've driven one of these rigs myself, and it's a game changer. It's totally different than driving diesel applications. So it's a technology that we should not be scared to adopt, because it's going to bring a lot of positive into transportation, middle mile transportation, and final mile applications as well. So I just wanted to kind of end things on a positive note with you guys here as we kind of bring this to a close. But that's my end note there, Chris.
Well, I appreciate you joining us for a few minutes, Adan. I really do. I know our conversation came at you in a lot of weird directions, but it would be great in the future to get with you and really explore kind of the nuts and bolts of what Watt EV is trying to get out there and do in the space, because it's important that we know the players. And I mean, everybody knows one player, right? Elon, but the rest is kind of up in the air, and that shuffle will happen. And I think those that create the infrastructure and have the land and the ability to have charging stations independent of the grid are the ones that are going to win big time. So again, I appreciate you visiting us for a few minutes, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Have a great one, and we'll talk soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That was an interesting discussion, and I think there's a lot to be unpacked over the course of the next really few years, because this technology is being driven at us so quickly. And Nico, the frustration you have is evident in the way you're bringing it out, and I think it's also indicative of kind of what the main of the market is probably feeling, because we didn't even discuss the fact that the way to create energy, electric energy, in this country and others is not exactly green.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of layers of constructing this whole thing that have to be parsed.
Okay, so we're green here, but to your point, all those precious minerals, precious metals, they're not exactly green where they make them in China, right?
You know what though?
So I mean, the hypocrisy is uncanny in that you go, we're going to be green here, but we're not. We don't really care where we source this.
I don't know if it's really necessarily hypocrisy, or if it's, see, there's an overriding almost theology. It's a philosophy, but it's almost theology. There's this overriding philosophy that the tide raises all boats, right?
Yeah.
And well, who's the tide in this case? It's the United States. And the powers that be that look down upon us look at things and say, okay, how do we raise other countries into a economic zone that doesn't force them to use coal as much, and doesn't force them to starve as much, and doesn't force them to be economically depressed as much? Well, you can give it to them, or you can be the first to do something. And then you can kind of drag everybody with you over time. All of us on this video, and most of the people that we know and associate with, are going to be severely negatively impacted economically before those other boats can rise. And therein lies the challenge.
The transportation industry, it's been about 20 years since regulations have really been tightened the same way they're being tightened now. But at the same time, it's not just to fuel tech that's being tightened. It's every aspect of the industry. And on top of that, you've got supply chain crisis after supply chain crisis. You've got truckers protesting. You've got blockades in Canada. You've got huge supplies of wheat and oil and all these things that are just being cut off. You've got COVID for the past 2 years. These are black horse factors that they're very difficult to account for. I guarantee, most financial projections for transportation companies were not accounting for Russia invading Ukraine in February when they were doing their Q1 forecast. So bottom line is that there's a cost for everything. What is the cost of green energy? What is the cost? Some people would say, well, the cost if you don't do it is we're all going to die in a couple years. Maybe, I don't know. I'm no expert on environmental stuff. However, there's also a cost to switching everything tomorrow. As you can see, gas prices, at least in California, have gone up almost $1.50 in the past week and a half. That is crushing some families alive this week. And hearing certain, political figures or celebrities kind of brush it off as nothing, saying you should have got a Tesla when I did 3 years ago. Well, 3.5 years ago, or 2 years ago, a pandemic was putting everyone out of a job. So at what point do we say, where is this middle ground between trying to make these ethical decisions for our environment and also making sure that the population and businesses that supply that population with food and shelter and everything else in between actually are able to survive in a world like that?
Maybe we can build or pour some money into inventing a motor that'll use our fossil fuels a lot more efficiently, because I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? If someone came out with a motor that went 1,000 miles a gallon,
Oh, game changer.
done. We're done. Because now the price of gas would probably be like 99 cents. Or okay, maybe not 99 cents. Maybe it's $100 a gallon, right? But you can go 1,000 miles to that gallon.
See,
And my
therein
goodness.
lies one of the challenges. You kind of hit it on the head though, because technology has changed over time. We mentioned this before when the carburetor went away from fuel injection systems
Yeah.
and how that increased the supply overnight. Same with the technologies you're talking about for extraction. Fracking is a great example. Extracting something through fracking. It may have increased the earthquake possibilities in the middle of the country, but it changed the dynamics in terms of fuel effectiveness and efficiency and extraction technologies. So we always come up with solutions. And Adan mentioned, there's a lot of smart people in the room that are going to come up with the right ideas to do things. But that doesn't mean we don't go over a lot of rough roads to get there. The difference now and then is that this is a dramatic shift. It's not a strategic course corrective kind of methodology. It's let's burn it down and then build it again. That's kind of the thought process today. And that may be in part because of our world wanting instant gratification all the time. That may be even part of it. There's a lot of components to this we probably can't unpack here, but I think that all of us have said some very interesting things along the line. And I think we're all right on the same page, knowing that no one likes to be told what they have to do. They like to have parameters set for them. And they like to see that those parameters gradually change over time with what is better for them as individuals and the society as a whole in conjunction with each other. Not sacrificing our entire lifestyle. I know that sounds pretentious as well, but it's sacrificing our entire lifestyle to disregard everything currently to go after some new technology that really has a lot of controversy.